There has been a bit of a head-scratching this side of the Atlantic at the announcements from Donald Trump, obviously, to the point where even those who might have been opposed to it in the beginning have now said, actually, we think that the starting point for this should be that Ukraine has NATO membership if we're going to get a deal over the line. Do you think that Trump's position will inevitably be walked back?
Donald Trump may be changing the entire future of the Ukraine war and potentially NATO itself. His latest position has raised serious questions about Ukraine's territory, NATO membership, American support, and what a future peace deal could actually look like. But here's where things get even more interesting. If Russia walks away with territory and Ukraine is left without strong security guarantees, what stops another invasion years from now? And while all of this is happening, China is watching. Could Trump's strategy finally end the war? Or could it create a much bigger problem for Europe and the United States? Let's break down what is really happening behind the headlines.
Let me then start by asking you whether or not you believe, in whatever fashion it comes out, what Trump has done now is signal the beginning of the end of the war in Ukraine.
I think he certainly has signaled the beginning of the end. I think it's even well beyond that. He has given away several key elements of what had been core American and NATO policies. I'm sure he told this directly to Putin in their 90-minute phone conversation yesterday, and they were announced by the defense secretary in the meetings about Ukraine and Europe giving up the common NATO objective of restoring Ukraine's full sovereignty and territorial integrity, giving up any chance of NATO membership, basically saying there's not going to be a NATO security guarantee, calling into question the future of American assistance and really the future of NATO itself. So I think this is launched on a very perilous course from Ukraine's point of view, but also from the alliance's point of view. I think this is probably one of Vladimir Putin's best days.
The assessment that it seems like Trump has come to is there should be no more bloodshed in order to try and push Russian troops out of Crimea, where they've been since 2014, or indeed four of the oblasts that Russia has taken over. Is that a wrong assessment? Should more troops be put in, more arms be sent to Ukraine to defend those areas, to push Russia out?
Well, I think there are several lessons that come before addressing that question, which is obviously the question on the table now. The first is, for 3 years, we didn't help Ukraine in a strategic fashion. I blame that primarily on the Biden administration. Arms were supplied after long, drawn-out public arguments about should we give them ATACMS, should we give them Abrams tanks, should we give them F-16s. And the weapons ultimately were not applied against the Russians in a strategic fashion. But by the same token, the Russian military has been severely weakened by this operation with huge casualties.
Yeah, but it strikes me, John, sorry to interrupt, but it strikes me that the NATO allies talking about Ukraine must win, there was never really a single coherent strategic definition of what win meant.
No, but I think there was. It is restoration of full sovereignty and territorial integrity. And what Russia has done in this war number 2, where the West failed miserably in war number 1 and has now failed in war number 2, is that it's doubled the amount of Ukrainian territory now controlled by Russia compared to 2014. So it's now got about 20% of Ukraine. Putin has been taken by Trump's invitation to visit him in Washington and to visit Putin in Moscow from being an international pariah to being one of the guys again. And it's a signal, particularly to China, which is what I worry about more than anything at this point, that unprovoked aggression can succeed. I think in Beijing, they're saying, look, if the Americans and NATO won't stand up to aggression in the center of Europe, what are they going to do when we come after Taiwan?
What would you expect then the British government to be thinking about security guarantees for Ukraine, possibly, as Trump has talked about previously, European boots in Ukraine to protect that peace? Do you think the British government should be expecting to send troops to Ukraine?
Well, I think, number one, I think it's pretty clear there's no chance under Trump there will be U.S. forces engaged in any kind of any activity like that in Ukraine. And people ought to decide what they mean by peacekeeping. The UN peacekeepers almost uniformly have rules of engagement that say they will use force only in self-defense. So it means they don't use force to keep the ceasefire in place. So if people think that the mere presence of UN peacekeepers or NATO peacekeepers or any kind of peacekeepers is going to stop the Russians from launching another invasion after they spend a few years regrouping and rearming, I think that's an illusion. I would recommend to Ukraine you don't agree to a demilitarized zone, you don't agree to international peacekeepers, because that will amount to de facto partition of the country.
There has been a bit of head scratching this side of the Atlantic at the announcements from Donald Trump, obviously, to the point where even those who might have been opposed to it in the beginning have now said, actually, we think that the starting point for this should be that Ukraine has NATO membership if we're going to get a deal over the line. Do you think that Trump's position will inevitably be walked back?
No. Look, I've been saying for years that I think it's highly probable that Trump will try and withdraw the United States from NATO. And he's already setting preconditions that will justify it. First he said back in his initial term, well, all these Europeans are not spending 2% of GDP on defense, which they pledged to do at the Cardiff NATO summit in 2014. Now he's saying you need to spend 5% of GDP on defense. I personally think that's what the U.S. should spend. I think in a challenging world, we're not spending enough, and we're at about 3% now. But I suspect there's almost no country in Europe, maybe the Baltics and Poland and a few others, that will go to 5%. So in a year, when it doesn't happen, Trump will be able to say, NATO is just as worthless as I always said it was. I'm getting out.
And what would that mean for European security, do you think?
I think you'll miss us when we're gone. That's what I think.
Because the world will be exposed to greater forces.
Yeah, look, when the U.S. withdraws and calls its alliances into question and weakens its allies, the status quo doesn't remain. Either chaos ensues or some adversary steps in to pick up the gap, which is why this is so dangerous. And Ukraine could well turn out to be the precipitating circumstance that leads to, if not American withdrawal, substantial decline in U.S. participation in NATO.
And I wonder what you've made then of the 3 weeks or 4 weeks, God knows how long it's been, of the second Trump administration, where he seems to have become rather more either expansionist, if you like, or withdrawn in world affairs, perhaps away from the America First attitude of the first term and much more easily into global affairs, whether it be in the Middle East or Eastern Europe.
Well, the only honest answer to that is nobody knows, and that includes Donald Trump, because it depends on how he feels later today or tomorrow or the day after that. But I think that the difference in approach that you're noting between sort of the isolationist stance in the first term and a 19th century imperialist attitude in effect in a second term is just further demonstration of what I think is the core point in trying to understand Trump, and that is he has no philosophy. He has no grand strategy. He doesn't do policy. He makes up his mind day to day. He could turn isolationist again while we're having this conversation. And I said in my book, the thousands of decisions he made in his first term, most of which I agreed with, they're just out there like an archipelago of dots. You can try and draw lines between them. He can't draw lines between them. Why did he decide he wanted to make Canada the 51st state? My view, he doesn't like Justin Trudeau. He knows Trudeau's on the down and outs about to end his prime ministership, and he's tweaking him and trolling him. Is that the way for the president of the United States to behave? Of course not. But we're talking about Donald Trump here.
Good to talk to you. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on.
The biggest issue here isn't simply whether Trump wants peace. It's what kind of peace he is trying to create. If Ukraine gives up territory, loses its path toward NATO membership, and receives weaker security guarantees, the war could end. But the underlying security problem may remain. That's why the analyst's warning about Russia is so important. A ceasefire isn't necessarily lasting peace. If Russia has time to rebuild and Ukraine remains vulnerable, the same conflict could potentially return years later. And then there's NATO. If America reduces its commitment to the alliance, Europe could be forced to dramatically increase its own defense spending and prepare for a future with less American protection. But perhaps the biggest audience isn't in Europe. It's Beijing. China will be watching closely to see what happens when a major power challenges the international order, and how strongly America and its allies respond. So this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about what America wants its role in the world to be. Do you think Trump's approach can deliver lasting peace, or could it simply pause the conflict and create a bigger problem later? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more political analysis.